Did the Russian Revolution actually have to happen?
Or was the rise of Bolshevism just a series of catastrophic missed opportunities, exploited by some very savvy opportunists?
Right. When we look back at 1917, are we seeing the inevitable march of history or a terrifying political accident?
That question is really the dynamite behind the book we're looking at today. Sean McMeekin's The Russian Revolution, A New History. And our mission here is to go beyond a simple summary.
We're doing what we're calling an extended analysis. We want to look at how McMeekin structures his entire narrative to persuade you, the reader, that it was an accident.
Exactly. We're examining how the author shapes his argument, how he builds his influence, and how he, well, earns or maybe loses your trust.
We hope this deep dive gives you the tools to read with a sharper insight, with greater discernment. It should really help you decide, should you read this book? It's also, I think, excellent for any aspiring writers out there, just to see how history is framed.
And if you do find this format valuable, we would genuinely love to hear from you. Your feedback really does help guide what we do in the future.
For this analysis, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM. It lets us get into a deeper, more dynamic analysis than ever before.
So let's start right at that core thesis, because McMeekin, he throws down the gauntlet immediately.
Oh, absolutely. This is a strongly revisionist, I'd say forcefully anti-communist narrative. He has zero interest in the idea of historical inevitability.
For him, 1917 wasn't some destined triumphant march of Marxist forces. It was a deeply contingent, morally freighted struggle.
It's a total pivot away from that old deterministic class struggle narrative. And to make such a bold claim, he first has to build his credibility, his ethos.
Right. He's a professional historian, an expert on Russia and World War I, and he grounds his authority in a really detailed, almost exhaustive reconstruction of events.
And he builds that credibility by leaning so heavily on archival research, specifically on military and diplomatic sources from 1917 that a lot of previous histories just didn't have access to or ignored.
Especially histories from the Soviet era, or even some from a Western Marxist viewpoint. He positions himself as the historian, correcting what he calls lazy or ideological myths.
That's a powerful position to take. He's basically saying, trust me, I have the documents that prove the old story is wrong. It aligns him with a kind of intellectual independence.
And the tone he uses fits that perfectly. He doesn't just narrate, he morally indicts. The book's purpose seems to be persuasion as much as it is exposition.
He wants to show the revolution wasn't this great emancipatory event, but the product of opportunists exploiting a weak government, a terrible war, and critically foreign money.
And you see that persuasive intent so clearly in how he characterizes the Bolshevik leaders. He never treats them as heroic revolutionaries.
Not at all. He calls them ruthless agitators, shameless hucksters, even political mercenaries. That kind of language is so deliberate. It's meant to diminish their moral standing from the very start.
It invites the reader to pass immediate moral judgment. So his ethos is built on this archival rigor. His tone is one of moral clarity. But how does he build the actual proof, the logic that it wasn't inevitable?
What are the specific arguments he uses to show history could have gone another way?
The entire logical frame is built on this idea of contingency. That specific poor choices, not deep structural forces, led to the October Revolution.
He points to a few pivotal moments, right? Moments where one different decision could have changed everything.
Yes, exactly. He shatters the idea that the working class just had to triumph.
So give us an example of one of these close calls. What was a key choice the provisional government made that he calls out as catastrophic?
The most glaring one, and he details this at length, is the decision to keep fighting World War I.
Under Alexander Kerensky.
Right. After the Tsar falls in February, the public is desperate for peace. But Kerensky was convinced Russia had this duty to its allies. McMeekin details the disastrous June offensive,
which was this massive, ill-conceived military push that just completely collapsed the army's morale.
Totally. So instead of consolidating power, giving the exhausted people what they desperately wanted, Land and Peace Kerensky chose more war. And that created the perfect vacuum for the Bolsheviks.
That one decision fueled the mutinies. It destroyed trust in the government.
And it radicalized the soldiers. Had Kerensky just opted for a quick armistice, the Bolsheviks would have lost their single most effective rallying cry: peace, land, and bread.
And that ties into the other massive contingent factor he emphasizes: German assistance. This wasn't a coincidence.
No, it was a deliberate military strategy by Imperial Germany. McMeekin uses diplomatic records to show that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were essentially a weapon Germany deployed to knock Russia out of the war.
They were funneling huge sums of money to them.
Enormous sums.
And
They paid for agitators, propaganda, newspapers. This wasn't just minor financing, it was critical foreign support. It gave the Bolsheviks a massive organizational advantage over their poorly funded rivals.
so that focus on specific choices, German diplomatic moves, Kerensky's military blunders, that's what directly undermines any deterministic story.
Exactly. If you can point to cash transfers and specific bad decisions, it suggests the revolution was driven by political opportunity and betrayal, not some preset economic clock.
And the very structure of the book reinforces that logic.
Powerfully, it's chronological, very scene-driven. He tracks the fall of the Romanovs, the brief flicker of the February Revolution, the short life of the provisional government, and then the final seizure of power. He ties each step to a concrete decision or indecision.
It creates this feeling of a sliding doors moment in history. He's constantly using counterfactuals, the what might have been.
And that's a persuasive strategy. He's not just speculating, he's holding up this lost possibility of a liberal, non-Soviet Russia against the grim reality of what happened.
That juxtaposition is incredibly effective. It creates this profound sense of tragedy.
That feeling of tragedy is the engine for his emotional argument, for the pathos. McMeekin knows that just laying out the logic isn't always enough. He's aiming for moral indignation, for sorrow.
He does that by focusing on the specific suffering that came from this revolution he argues was avoidable. He uses these highly charged depictions to steer your emotional judgment firmly against Bolshevism.
The examples are stark, they're visceral. He details the executions of clergy, the destruction and pillaging of churches, these attacks on the traditional heart of Russian culture.
But the moral indictment really lands when he describes the period of war communism.
That's where he describes the state-enforced famine, the grain requisitioning, the sheer brutality of the Civil War. He doesn't gloss over it. He centers the human devastation of the Red Terror to force you to confront the real cost of a revolution he claims was fundamentally unnecessary.
That powerful emphasis on suffering and moral choice is what makes the book so compelling, especially for readers already skeptical of revolutionary ideals.
It's a very, very persuasive form of historical storytelling.
Speaking of compelling analysis, for other in-depth critiques and summaries that inspire reflection and rational thought, you can find Mindful Moments. That's our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. We hope you'll check it out.
So moving on to the overall effectiveness of McMeekin's rhetoric, his approach works extremely well for his target audience.
Which is the non-specialist but historically literate reader, someone who's probably already a bit suspicious of those grand Marxist narratives.
Yes, the accessibility, the strong sense of moral authority he builds, and the emotionally resonant story, it all combines to make these complex events feel immediate and intelligible. It's a powerful alternative to class-centered accounts.
But he doesn't just live it in 1921. He deliberately makes the history feel contemporary.
He does. He uses allusions to draw parallels between the crises of 1917 and modern political struggles, especially around ideas of wealth redistribution and state control.
The epilogue is really a rhetorical masterstroke in that sense. He recasts Leninism not as a historical failure of the 20th century,
but as a durable, dangerous inclination that can never be truly uninvented. And that's how he turns this history into an explicit cautionary tale for you, the 21st century reader.
especially regarding the renewed interest in socialist politics in the West. It's a warning that opportunism, backed by ideology, is always lurking.
But every strong argument, especially one this forceful, has its limitations. If his goal is political and moral clarity, what do his critics say he sacrifices to get there?
The critics, especially from the Marxist left or those who favor social history, they argue that this adversarial tone and ideological framing, it leads to caricature.
And selective use of evidence. They often dismiss the book as ideological anti-communist propaganda because of that fierce stance.
So their argument is that the focus on Bolshevik malice, on them just being hucksters, comes at the expense of explaining the profound social collapse that gave them an audience in the first place.
Precisely. The book pays less attention to the deeper social dynamics, the desperation of the peasants for land, the complete exhaustion with the Tsar, the spontaneous collapse of the military.
So it might underrepresent the view that the revolution was rooted in these unavoidable social and economic grievances.
In other words, while McMeekin is brilliant at puncturing the myth of revolutionary heroism, by focusing on specific, avoidable political mistakes.
He risks oversimplifying the socioeconomic tinderbox that made those mistakes so explosive.
Exactly. He prioritizes that political and moral clarity over a more multivocal interpretive framework,
Yeah.
which is a valid choice for an author with a clear, persuasive goal.
But it's essential for you, the reader, to recognize that ideological choice when you approach the book. It's a powerful argument, but it isn't the final word.
So what does this all mean for us today? Considering McMeekin's focus on contingency and individual choices, on this idea that nothing had to happen the way it did, how does the rhetoric of inevitability shape how we see political and social movements now?
That's a great question. If things are never inevitable, how much moral weight do we assign to the political actions and decisions being made today?
A provocative thought. That sense of historical agency it's powerful.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.